It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when 8-year-old Ava was playing outside with her friends, laughing as they ran through the sprinklers in the front yard. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the quiet suburban street. To anyone looking from the outside, it seemed like a peaceful neighborhood, the kind where nothing ever really went wrong. Ava's mother, Detective Mia, had always told her to enjoy the simplicity of these moments, because, in the blink of an eye, things could change. Little did they know, today would be the day that everything would change for both of them. Ava was used to these carefree afternoons, but today was different. As she and her friends raced around the yard, the sound of a police siren cut through the air, sending a brief ripple of tension through the group. Ava's heart skipped a beat when she saw a patrol car pull up in front of their house. A tall officer stepped out, his stern expression barely visible behind the mirrored sunglasses. His boots hit the pavement with heavy steps as he approached the group of kids. Ava's friends, confused and a little nervous, quickly scattered to the side. Ava stayed frozen, her eyes wide as she wondered why a cop would stop here. The officer's gaze immediately locked onto Ava. His eyes narrowed as he looked her up and down. "What's your name, little girl?" he asked gruffly, his voice carrying an edge of authority that made Ava feel small and exposed. Ava," she stammered, her hands instinctively clasping together in front of her. The officer didn't respond with a smile or a kind word. Instead, he gave her a once-over, his tone sharp and dismissive. "You shouldn't be running around like that in a neighborhood like this. You're just asking for trouble." Ava blinked, unsure of what he meant. Her neighborhood wasn't like the one she had seen on the news. It was quiet, safe, and, most importantly, home. But the officer's words stung, and she felt a knot form in her stomach. Her friends were staring at her now, but no one spoke up. They all sensed something wasn't right. The officer continued, his words cutting deeper. "What are you even doing out here? Shouldn't you be in school, not playing in the street?" Ava felt a rush of panic. She had done nothing wrong. She wasn't even close to the street. But before she could defend herself, the officer raised his hand, dismissing her with a wave. "Just go inside, okay? You're lucky I don't report you for being out here unsupervised. Go home before something happens to you." The harshness in his voice made her stomach churn. She didn't understand why he was being so rude to her, but her confusion was soon replaced by embarrassment. Her friends were no longer laughing. They had gone silent, watching with wide eyes as the officer towered over Ava. Feeling the weight of their gazes, she wanted to shrink away, but she stood her ground. Just as the officer was about to turn to leave, he glanced down at his phone, checking something quickly before looking back at Ava. "What, you're not even going to apologize for being out here? No respect for the law?" Ava opened her mouth to speak, but the words got stuck in her throat. She didn't know what to say. The officer's words were like daggers, piercing through her sense of security. All she wanted was to go back to playing, to forget about this awkward moment. But the officer wasn't done yet. He took one last look at her, his eyes cold. "That's what's wrong with kids today," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "No respect for authority." Before she could even process what had just happened, the officer was back in his car, peeling away from the curb. The sound of the engine fading in the distance felt like a slap in the face. Ava stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Her friends slowly gathered around her, their faces a mix of sympathy and uncertainty. "I'm sorry, Ava," one of them said, looking down. "That was weird." Ava's face flushed with humiliation. She didn't want their sympathy. She didn't even know what had just happened, but she knew one thing for sure: she had been treated differently, just because of who she was. As she walked slowly back toward the house, a chill ran down her spine. It wasn't just what the officer had said to her, it was the feeling that lingered. That feeling of being judged, unfairly and without reason. What made it worse was that Ava's mom, Mia, wasn't around to witness it. Mia worked as a detective for the FBI, and though she wasn't always home, she'd made sure Ava understood the importance of standing up for herself and doing what was right. But today, Ava felt as though she had no control over the situation. The officer's words echoed in her mind, no respect for authority. Ava had done nothing wrong, but to him, she was already guilty. As she opened the door to her house, Ava was greeted by the familiar warmth of her mother's cooking in the kitchen. Mia was humming softly as she prepared dinner, her FBI badge still clipped to her waistband from a long day at work. Ava hesitated at the doorway, unsure how to tell her mother about what had just happened. She wanted to speak, but the words stuck in her throat. Mia looked up, sensing her daughter's discomfort. "Hey, kiddo. What's wrong?" Ava's eyes filled with tears as she stepped into the kitchen. "Mom, a cop yelled at me outside. He said I was in trouble and that I didn't respect the law." Mia's face hardened at the mention of the officer. She set the spatula down and turned fully toward her daughter. "What exactly did he say, Ava?" Ava, her voice shaky, relayed the entire incident. The more she spoke, the more Mia's expression shifted from concern to something else, something more serious, something darker. By the time Ava finished, Mia was already on the phone with someone in the department. Her tone was calm but firm, as if she were slipping into professional mode. "Stay here, Ava," Mia said, her voice more authoritative than Ava had ever heard it. "I'm going to handle this." And just like that, a regular afternoon took a sharp turn into something far more intense. The wheels of change began to turn, setting in motion a chain of events that would shake both their lives to the core. Little did Ava know, the officer who had humiliated her was about to face a reckoning, one that would alter his career forever. And as Mia prepared to take action, she knew that this was no longer just about her daughter. It was about justice, about making sure that no one, especially an innocent child, would ever be treated this way again. Mia had always been a protector. As an FBI agent, her job was to defend the innocent, to fight for justice, and to expose corruption when it reared its ugly head. But as she listened to Ava's story, she realized this was no longer just a professional case. This was personal. Her heart tightened as she looked at her daughter, sitting at the kitchen table, the weight of the world already pressing down on her small shoulders. Ava had always been a bright, curious child, full of life and promise. But now, this experience had shaken her confidence. The sting of the officer's words lingered, and Mia knew that this moment would stay with her daughter forever, shaping the way she viewed the world around her. Ava was still quiet, her eyes downcast. She had never been the type to get upset over small things, but this wasn't small. This was bigger than just a bad day or a hurtful comment. The fact that a law enforcement officer, someone who was supposed to be a protector, could treat her that way, was something Ava couldn't wrap her young mind around. How could anyone, especially someone in a position of power, treat her like that? She wasn't a criminal. She wasn't doing anything wrong. Yet, for reasons she couldn't understand, she had been humiliated. Her heart raced as she replayed the scene in her head, each word the officer had said, each dismissive glance, each cruel sentence that made her feel small and invisible. Mia could see the confusion in her daughter's eyes, the hurt that ran deeper than just the officer's words. The fact that Ava felt like she didn't belong, like the world was turning on her for something she couldn't control, broke Mia's heart. She had spent years teaching her daughter to stand tall, to speak her truth, and to never let anyone make her feel less than what she was, a smart, strong, and capable young girl. But in that moment, Mia knew she had failed to prepare her for this particular kind of battle. Racism, prejudice, and discrimination, those were real, ugly forces, and they didn't always come with an obvious explanation. Sometimes, they came in the form of a police officer's scorn. The kitchen was silent except for the occasional clink of utensils as Mia set the table. She knew Ava needed time to process, to breathe. But Mia couldn't ignore the urgency of what had just happened. She could feel her pulse quicken as her mind raced through the possibilities. This wasn't just about one cop being rude or inappropriate. This was about something much bigger. Ava had been the victim of something far more insidious than a momentary lapse in judgment. This was an abuse of power. This was an officer, someone sworn to serve and protect, who had used his position to humiliate an innocent child, simply because of the color of her skin. Mia's eyes narrowed as she processed the details. It wasn't just the officer's behavior that disgusted her, it was his complete disregard for the person Ava was. As an FBI agent, Mia had seen it all: corruption, criminal behavior, and injustice in many forms. But this? This was something different. It was a violation of trust, not just toward Ava, but toward the entire community. People relied on officers of the law to keep them safe. They didn't expect to be judged or made to feel inferior by the very individuals who were supposed to be protecting them. This officer, this man who had sworn an oath to uphold justice, had done the opposite. Ava looked up at her mother, her voice trembling. "Mom, do you think he's going to hurt someone else like that?" "I don't know what I did wrong." Mia's heart broke. "No, baby, you didn't do anything wrong. You were just being you. But sometimes people don't see us the way we see ourselves." Mia paused, choosing her words carefully. "You're not the one who has to change. He's the one who was wrong." Mia reached out, taking her daughter's hand in hers. She could feel the weight of her daughter's pain, but she also felt something else rising within her, a fierce determination. She had sworn an oath to serve justice, and now that same oath would guide her actions. The idea that an officer could behave this way, unchecked, was unacceptable. Mia knew she had the power to make things right. It wasn't just about teaching Ava to stand tall. It was about ensuring that others would never have to experience what her daughter had. It was time to act. After a few moments of quiet, Mia stood up from the table. "Ava, I need to make a phone call. I'll be right back." She moved toward the living room, her phone already in her hand. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she debated who to call first. She could go to her local precinct, but Mia knew that dealing with the issue locally might not be enough. She needed someone in her corner, someone who could help her expose what had happened. She thought about her colleagues at the FBI, the ones she trusted most. They would listen. They would understand the gravity of the situation. Mia took a deep breath and dialed the number for her colleague, Agent Laura Williams, a senior investigator with the Civil Rights Division. Laura had been with the Bureau for over 15 years and had handled cases that involved police misconduct before. Mia trusted her with everything. The phone rang twice before Laura picked up. "Mia, what's going on?" Laura's voice was calm, but Mia could hear the concern in it. Mia didn't waste any time. "It's Ava. She's been humiliated by a cop outside our house. I need your help. We need to investigate this officer. I don't care what it takes, he needs to be held accountable." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Mia knew Laura was processing the gravity of what she was saying. "I'm so sorry, Mia. That's terrible. You're sure about this? You want to go after a cop?" "I'm sure. I don't care who he is or how long he's been serving. This is bigger than him, Laura. This is about every child who has ever been judged unfairly, about every person who has been looked down upon simply for existing in their own skin. This has to stop." Laura's voice softened, but there was a fire in it now. "All right. I'm in. Let's do this the right way. We'll need to gather evidence, talk to witnesses. You can't do this alone, Mia. We'll get him." Mia hung up the phone, her heart racing. This wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick. But it was the right thing to do. She wasn't just fighting for Ava anymore. She was fighting for every child who had ever been made to feel less than. She was fighting for justice. When she walked back into the kitchen, Ava looked up at her with questioning eyes. Mia smiled softly, but there was a quiet resolve in her expression. "We're going to make sure this officer answers for what he did, Ava. No one gets away with treating you like that." Ava's eyes shone with a mixture of hope and fear. She didn't know exactly what her mother had planned, but she knew one thing for sure: with Mia on her side, things were about to change. The next few days passed in a blur for Mia. Her mind was consumed with thoughts of what had happened to Ava, and every conversation she had seemed to circle back to the officer who had humiliated her daughter. She had always prided herself on being a protector, a pillar of strength in both her family and her career, but this situation was different. This wasn't just about one wrongful encounter, it was about the deep, systemic issues that plagued the relationship between law enforcement and communities like hers. And if she didn't act, if she didn't fight for change, she couldn't live with herself. Mia made a few calls to her colleagues at the FBI's Civil Rights Division, but it wasn't until she got a call from Agent Laura Williams that things started moving. Laura was a senior investigator with years of experience in dealing with police misconduct and civil rights violations, and her reputation for getting results was unmatched. When Mia explained the situation in detail, Laura didn't hesitate. "I'll send someone out to your area," she said. "We'll start by reviewing any footage, looking into the officer's history, and interviewing anyone who might have witnessed the interaction." That was the first glimmer of hope Mia had felt since the incident. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, this officer, this man who had wielded his power against her daughter, might finally be held accountable. But she knew that would only be the beginning. To get justice for Ava, she had to be strategic. She needed evidence, documentation, and most importantly, the courage to face the truth, no matter how difficult it was. Over the next few days, the investigation began to take shape. Laura's team worked quickly, gathering surveillance footage from nearby businesses, speaking to neighbors who had witnessed the interaction, and even reaching out to Ava's friends to get their testimonies. The more information they gathered, the more the pieces fell into place. The officer's actions were not isolated. They weren't a case of a bad day or an offhand comment. It was clear that this officer had a pattern of mistreating people, especially young black children. And the worst part? No one had spoken up before. This was, tragically, a common occurrence, swept under the rug time and time again. Mia couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in her stomach. She had seen this before, in different cases, in different communities. She had seen officers get away with far worse, and she knew how easily the system could protect them. This wasn't just about taking down one bad cop, it was about exposing the culture that allowed this kind of behavior to thrive. Mia had worked hard to earn the respect of her colleagues, but this was personal. It wasn't just about justice for Ava, it was about changing the system for good. Despite her determination, Mia couldn't help but feel the weight of what she was asking for. She knew that the road ahead would be messy, difficult, and full of resistance. But as she sat across from Ava at the kitchen table one evening, watching her daughter slowly regain her confidence, Mia realized there was no other choice. She had to do this, not just for Ava, but for every child who had ever been made to feel small because of their race. "Mama," Ava said quietly one evening, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, "do you think this is going to end soon?" Mia took a deep breath and smiled softly. She could see the uncertainty in her daughter's eyes, the same uncertainty she felt inside herself. "I can't promise it'll be quick, baby. But I can promise you this, I will fight for you. And I will fight for what's right." The sound of a knock on the door broke their conversation. Mia stood and opened it to find Agent Laura Williams standing in the doorway, a solemn look on her face. Behind her, two other agents carried a stack of files and folders. They had all the evidence they needed to proceed. "Mia," Laura said as she walked in, "I think we've got enough to go forward. We've interviewed witnesses, we've got the footage, and we've dug into the officer's past. This isn't just a one-time thing. He's been involved in multiple incidents of misconduct, and it's time we hold him accountable." Mia's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment when everything would change. "What's the next step?" she asked, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "We're going to bring this to the department," Laura replied. "We'll file an official complaint and demand an investigation. And, if necessary, we'll take this to the media. But it's important that we have all our ducks in a row before we do anything. We don't want to give them any chance to cover it up." Mia nodded. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but she was ready. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of clarity. The truth was out there, and she was going to make sure it was heard. The following weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and legal procedures. Mia spent countless hours reviewing the evidence, preparing statements, and organizing a team to confront the department. Each step forward felt like a battle, and Mia knew that the department wasn't going to just hand over justice. They would fight, and they would resist. But Mia wasn't going to back down. One evening, Mia sat down with Ava and explained the next steps. "Baby, this is going to be hard, but we're going to keep pushing for what's right. The officer who hurt you, he's going to answer for what he did. But there's more at stake here. This isn't just about you. This is about making sure that no one, no matter where they come from or what they look like, is treated this way again." Ava nodded slowly, her face a mixture of sadness and resolve. "I don't want anyone else to go through what I did, Mama. I just want them to stop." Mia felt her heart swell with pride. Ava's bravery, her quiet strength, was everything Mia needed to keep going. Ava had faced this injustice head-on, and now it was Mia's turn to do the same. With each passing day, the investigation continued to unfold. Mia received regular updates from Laura, each one a step closer to uncovering the full scope of the officer's misconduct. They were building a case strong enough to ensure that this officer would never be allowed to serve in law enforcement again. But as the pieces came together, Mia's anger grew. She had seen how easy it was for powerful people to protect their own, to sweep things under the rug. But this time, Mia was determined to make sure that the truth could no longer be ignored. On a cold morning in early December, Mia stood in front of a room full of people at the local police department. The chief of police, the department's attorneys, and several senior officers were all gathered. The atmosphere was tense. Mia was about to make her case. "I'm here today because my daughter was humiliated by one of your officers. I'm not just speaking for her, I'm speaking for every person who has ever been treated this way. You can no longer hide behind your badges. It's time for the truth to come out," Mia said, her voice steady but filled with authority. There was no turning back now. The fight for justice had begun, and Mia was determined to win. As Mia stood before the room full of officers and attorneys, the weight of her words hung in the air. The tension was palpable, every person in the room aware that they were at a crossroads. For Mia, this was more than just a fight for justice, it was a battle to reclaim the dignity that had been stolen from her daughter. She could feel the intensity of the moment, the gravity of what she was about to say, and what was at stake. She had never imagined that a single encounter could spiral into something this large, this complex, but now that it had, Mia knew she couldn't back down. Her voice rang out with unwavering authority as she continued, "This isn't just about one officer. This is about a system that too often turns a blind eye to its own. A system that allows officers like him to abuse their power with impunity, all while hiding behind a badge. You can pretend that this is an isolated incident, but I know, this is far from the first time this has happened. And I won't let it be the last." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as Mia's words landed with a heavy impact. She could see the officers shift uncomfortably, some avoiding her gaze, while others seemed almost defensive, as if bracing for the storm she was about to unleash. But Mia wasn't there to play nice. She wasn't there to ask for mercy. She was there to demand accountability. She turned to Laura, who was standing beside her, silently watching the proceedings. Laura had been with her every step of the way, gathering evidence, conducting interviews, and building the case that Mia knew would change everything. Together, they had compiled a mountain of proof, surveillance footage showing the officers' interactions with not just Ava, but other children and community members, testimony from witnesses who had seen the officer act with hostility in similar situations, and even records showing that this officer had a history of complaints against him that had been quietly swept under the rug. It was all there, laid out in black and white, and Mia knew that if they could just break through the department's resistance, the truth would be undeniable. As Mia looked back at the room, she could feel the sting of anger rising in her chest. She could see the department's attorneys already preparing their counterarguments. They were going to try to downplay the situation, discredit the witnesses, and deflect any blame. Mia had seen it all before, in countless cases where the system protected its own. But she wasn't about to let that happen. Not this time. The chief of police, a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and a stiff posture, cleared his throat. His eyes flicked between the documents on the table and Mia, but there was no sign of remorse or even acknowledgement of the seriousness of the situation. He spoke with a tone that suggested he had dealt with this kind of thing before, that he had faced angry citizens and outraged families many times, and that he knew how to quell them with a few carefully chosen words. "Mia," the chief began, his voice smooth and calculated, "we take these matters very seriously. But you must understand, we are committed to supporting our officers. This officer has served this department for over a decade, with an impeccable record. I don't deny that the situation was unfortunate, but accusations like these are serious. We must ensure that we follow due process." Mia's heart raced as she listened to his words, the thinly veiled defensiveness barely masking the indifference he had toward what had happened to Ava. This wasn't about due process. This wasn't about protecting an officer's record. This was about justice for her daughter, and she would make sure that no one in that room could ignore it. She stepped forward, her eyes locking with the chief's, unflinching. "Your officer violated my daughter's rights, and he humiliated her in front of a group of people. Don't talk to me about due process. What's happening here is a cover-up. You think that because he's been on the force for a decade, that makes him untouchable? That makes him immune to accountability?" Mia's voice was steady, but there was a fierce edge to it now. "You're wrong. He's not above the law, and neither are you. I'm here to make sure you all understand that." There was a slight shift in the room as Mia's words reverberated. The chief's confident demeanor faltered for just a second, but it was enough. Mia could see the uncertainty begin to spread like a ripple across the room, even among the attorneys who had been so quick to defend the officer. Laura took a step forward, joining Mia at the center of the table. "What Mia is trying to say is that this is about more than just this one incident. We're looking at a pattern of behavior that goes beyond a single mistake. There's a history of this officer's actions, and they've been ignored for far too long. We have the evidence. And we won't let you dismiss it." The room went even quieter, and the weight of Laura's words hung heavily in the air. Mia could feel the tide turning, and she knew that this was the moment. If they didn't act now, if they didn't make their stand, the system would swallow the truth whole, as it had done so many times before. She turned back to the chief, her eyes narrowing. "I've worked in law enforcement long enough to know how this game is played. You'll try to make it go away. You'll say it's a misunderstanding, or you'll push it off onto some bad apple excuse. But I'm not leaving until this officer is held accountable. We're not backing down. You can't hide behind your badge anymore." Mia's words were met with an unsettling silence, but beneath it, she could feel the pressure building. The department wasn't used to this kind of pushback, and Mia was ready to push harder. She wasn't going to give them the option to ignore this, to bury it under legal jargon and bureaucracy. The chief of police finally broke the silence, his voice colder now. "I understand your concerns, Mia, but you have to understand the implications of this. Going public with these accusations could hurt the department's reputation. It could affect public trust. We have to think about the bigger picture here." Mia's eyes flashed with intensity. "The bigger picture," she repeated, incredulous. "The bigger picture is that children are being mistreated by those sworn to protect them, and nobody is doing anything about it. What's bigger than that?" At that moment, one of the attorneys at the table spoke up, his voice hesitant but serious. "Perhaps it's time we take a step back and consider the full context of the situation. We may need to move forward with a deeper investigation into this officer's actions. If what you're saying is true, this officer's career could be over." Mia could feel the shift in the room. The atmosphere was no longer one of quiet resistance, but of reluctant acceptance. The weight of the evidence, combined with Mia's steadfast resolve, had pushed them into a corner. They couldn't deny the truth any longer. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Mia allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. It wasn't over yet. The road ahead would still be long, and there would be many battles to fight. But she had taken the first step. She had called out the system, and now it was time for the truth to come to light. The officer's career was on the line, but so was the future of the community Mia had spent her life protecting. This was the moment she had been fighting for. She wasn't going to stop until justice was served, not just for Ava, but for every child who had ever been hurt by those in power. The fight had only just begun. The following weeks brought a relentless cycle of pressure, stress, and moments of doubt. Mia had never been one to back away from a challenge, but as she watched the investigation unfold, the reality of what she was up against began to set in. There were days when the weight of the fight seemed unbearable, as if every step forward was met with 2 steps back. She could see the system closing in on itself, trying to protect one of its own, and every conversation she had with Laura only reinforced how difficult this was going to be. But Mia knew one thing for sure: there was no turning back now. As the investigation deepened, more and more information about the officer's history came to light. The team had uncovered records of prior complaints from other community members who had been subjected to similar treatment, harassment, racial profiling, and outright hostility. But what made this case different was Ava. Her innocence and vulnerability had become the turning point, the catalyst for a deeper investigation into the officer's behavior. Mia knew the public outrage that would follow once the full scope of the officer's actions was revealed. This wasn't just about Ava anymore, it was about exposing the rot within the department and changing the culture that allowed officers like him to thrive unchecked. The media caught wind of the story. Slowly but surely, local news outlets began to report on the case, and the story of Ava, the young girl humiliated by a cop, began to make waves. The local community rallied behind the family, creating a groundswell of support that started to put pressure on the police department. It was a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, Mia felt vindicated by the public's outrage, knowing that Ava's story was giving voice to the countless others who had suffered in silence. But on the other hand, she couldn't shake the feeling of dread that loomed over her every time she saw a new headline or heard a reporter's voice on the radio. The scrutiny grew, and with it came threats. They started small, anonymous letters, strange calls at odd hours of the night, cryptic social media messages, but they escalated quickly. At first, Mia tried to brush them off. She had been through enough in her career to know that when you stir the pot, people don't like it. But the more the threats piled up, the more she began to worry. It wasn't just about her anymore, it was about Ava's safety, the safety of her family. This wasn't just a fight for justice, it was a fight for survival. One evening, after Mia had just returned from another round of meetings with Laura, she found a letter waiting for her on the kitchen table. It was simple, the message stark and chilling: "You don't know what you've started. Leave it alone, or you'll regret it." She sat down heavily, reading the letter over and over again. It wasn't the first threat she'd received, but this one felt different. The language was more direct, more personal. Whoever had sent it was making it clear that they knew exactly who she was and what she was trying to do. Mia had expected backlash, but this felt like a warning. She picked up the phone and dialed Laura's number. When Laura answered, her voice was calm but concerned. "Mia, I know it's getting harder. But we've come too far to stop now. This is exactly what they want, to intimidate you into backing down. Don't give them that power." Mia's jaw clenched as she looked at the letter again. "I won't back down. I know what I'm doing is right, but I don't want to risk my family. Ava's already been through enough." Laura's voice softened. "I understand, but don't let fear make this decision for you. If we don't push forward now, it will be harder for the next person, and the next. You're not just fighting for Ava anymore. You're fighting for change." Mia took a deep breath. She had always been the one in control, always the one who made the tough decisions. But now, she felt the weight of it all more than ever. Still, as she looked around her home, at Ava's drawings scattered on the fridge and the empty seat where her husband once sat, Mia knew she couldn't stop. She had started this, and she was going to finish it. The next morning, as Mia prepared for another round of meetings, she was met by the sight of a police car parked outside her home. Her heart skipped a beat. Had the threats escalated to something more? She stepped cautiously toward the door and opened it, finding one of the officers from Laura's team waiting on the porch. "Mia," the officer said gently, "we've increased surveillance around your house. It's not uncommon for these kinds of things to escalate when an officer is involved in a scandal like this. We're taking all the necessary precautions." Mia nodded, grateful for the support but still shaken. "Thank you," she said, trying to mask the fear creeping into her voice. "But I won't back down. I just need to know Ava is safe." The officer offered a reassuring smile. "We'll make sure of it. But be careful. The department is watching you now, and they won't take kindly to what you're doing." Mia's mind was racing as she watched the officer leave. It wasn't just the department she had to worry about anymore, it was the culture that had allowed this officer's behavior to go unchecked for so long. People were afraid to speak up, afraid of the consequences. But Mia wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The day of the hearing finally arrived. The room was filled with tension as the attorneys, police officials, and investigators gathered. Mia and Laura stood at the front, their faces resolute. The officers in the room avoided looking at Mia, but she could feel their eyes on her. She had spent years working alongside law enforcement, but now, she was standing on the opposite side. She was the one fighting for justice, not just for Ava, but for every child who had been humiliated and mistreated by those meant to protect them. The hearing began with the usual formalities, but Mia wasn't here for pleasantries. As the evidence was presented, video footage, witness testimonies, and the officer's prior complaints, Mia watched as the room slowly began to turn. The officer at the center of it all, the one who had humiliated Ava, sat with his back straight, his face hard as stone. But Mia could see it, the crack in his armor. He was starting to realize that he wasn't going to get away with this. Not this time. When the floor opened for statements, Mia stepped forward. The room fell silent as she spoke. "This isn't just about one officer," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "This is about every child who has ever been treated like they don't matter. This is about a culture within law enforcement that values the protection of its own over the lives of the people it's sworn to protect. I'm here because my daughter was humiliated. But I'm also here because no one else should have to go through what she did." Mia's words hung in the air, and for the first time, the room seemed to listen. The officer who had once seemed untouchable now looked as though the ground beneath him was shifting. The hearing continued, but Mia knew the tide had turned. The truth was out now, and there was no hiding from it. The battle wasn't over, but as Mia walked out of that room, she felt a sense of power she hadn't felt in weeks. The system might fight back, but the truth was unstoppable. And no matter what happened next, she had done what she came to do. She had made sure her daughter's voice was heard. In the weeks following the hearing, Mia couldn't shake the sense of urgency that continued to pulse through her veins. The department had launched an internal investigation into Officer Cole, but Mia knew this wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. Despite the initial wave of media attention and the increasing number of supporters rallying behind her, she still found herself in the eye of a storm. The world had seen Ava's story, and now they were watching. What would happen next? Mia wasn't sure, but she was determined to make sure it was something that would bring about real change. The officer's future hung in the balance. Every day, Mia waited to hear the results of the investigation, hoping to learn that justice would be served, hoping that this man who had shattered her daughter's innocence would finally be held accountable. But there were days when doubt crept in. She could see the way the department seemed to protect its own, the way they worked tirelessly behind closed doors to contain the damage. Mia knew that if they could find a way to spin this, minimize it, cover it up, they would. They always did. One evening, as Mia sat in her living room, her phone buzzed. It was Laura, her voice tight on the other end. "Mia, they're trying to sweep it under the rug. The department's making a deal to avoid a public trial. They're offering a settlement to you and Ava." Mia's heart pounded in her chest. A settlement? It felt like a hollow victory, a way to make the whole thing go away without anyone really facing consequences. She had heard of such deals before, how they were used to avoid the discomfort of accountability. It was never really about justice, it was about protecting the department's image. Tell me what they're offering, Mia replied, her voice calm but filled with determination. The details were hazy at first, but soon, Mia understood the terms. The department was willing to pay a significant amount of money, something that could change their lives, a financial cushion to ease the pain of this chapter. But there was a catch. The settlement would require them to drop all criminal charges, to cease their public campaign against the officer, and to promise never to speak about the incident again. Essentially, it was an attempt to silence them. It was an offer that Mia found repulsive. No amount of money could make up for what Ava had gone through, nor could it undo the damage done to the community's trust in the police. Mia didn't hesitate. She turned down the offer without a second thought. I'm not doing this for money, she said firmly. I'm doing this because no one should ever have to go through what Ava went through. And if I accept this, then it means I'm letting it happen again. Laura supported her decision, but Mia knew the road ahead would be even more difficult. Refusing the settlement meant they were going to court. The officer, now in the public eye, would fight back with everything he had. The department would pull every string, use every tactic, to bury this story, to paint themselves as the victim. Mia couldn't blame them, no one in power wanted to admit they had failed. But she wasn't going to let them rewrite this story. She had seen how easily they tried to bury the truth, and she couldn't let that happen to her daughter or anyone else. The days leading up to the trial were agonizing. Ava, who had been remarkably resilient throughout the entire ordeal, began to show signs of stress. She withdrew more, her once bubbly personality tempered by the weight of the constant scrutiny. Mia watched as her daughter struggled to make sense of what was happening, as Ava began to ask questions she didn't have answers for. Why did the officer do this to me, Mom? She asked one evening, her voice small and uncertain. Mia had no easy answer for her. Because there are some people in this world who forget that we're all human, sweetie. But you've taught me something, Ava. You've shown me that no matter what happens, we keep fighting for what's right. We keep pushing, even when it seems impossible. It was one of those moments that reinforced why she couldn't back down. Mia knew that this wasn't just about her family, it was about making sure her daughter's story wasn't just heard, but remembered. It was about shining a light on the darkness that had been allowed to fester within law enforcement, on the systems that upheld it, and on the silent complicity that allowed it to thrive. She wasn't fighting for personal revenge. She was fighting for accountability. The trial began with the usual procedural motions, the lawyers setting the stage for what would be a brutal battle. But as soon as Mia took the stand and spoke about Ava's experience, everything shifted. Her calm yet unwavering testimony had an impact that no one could ignore. She didn't just recount what had happened to her daughter, she conveyed the pain, the humiliation, the feeling of being violated not just as a mother, but as a member of the community who had trusted those who were supposed to protect her. The jury listened. The media recorded. And as Mia's words reached the public, it was clear that this case was far bigger than one officer's actions. The officer's defense team tried to discredit Mia, to paint her as an angry, vengeful mother who couldn't accept the reality of the situation. They attacked her credibility, twisted her words, and tried to undermine the weight of her testimony. But Mia wasn't deterred. Every time they tried to pull her down, she rose higher. She spoke the truth, and nothing could erase that. In the end, after days of heated exchanges and mounting tension, the jury returned with a verdict that shocked everyone in the courtroom. The officer was found guilty of misconduct, racial profiling, and abuse of power. The judge delivered a scathing statement, condemning the officer's actions and declaring that his career in law enforcement was over. Mia felt a sense of vindication she hadn't allowed herself to believe in. But even in that moment, the victory didn't feel complete. It was a step in the right direction, but it was just the beginning. The officer's conviction sent ripples through the community. It was a victory not just for Ava, but for every person who had ever been silenced or ignored. Mia knew that her fight wasn't over. She had taken on the system, and now, she was determined to make sure it never happened again. The battle had been long, and it had cost her more than she cared to admit, but as she walked out of the courtroom that day, she felt something stir inside her, a sense of justice, of having done the right thing. She had fought not just for her daughter, but for all the people who would never have a voice in the face of injustice. As she looked at Ava, who was standing beside her, her hand in hers, Mia couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of pride. Ava had been through so much, yet she had come out of it stronger. Together, they had changed the narrative. Together, they had held the system accountable. And Mia knew that, no matter what came next, she had done the one thing she had promised herself she would do: protect her daughter's future, and make sure this story was one that would be told for generations to come.